In southern Louisiana this summer, the heat index climbed to a punishing 121 degrees, hot enough that meteorologists placed the region under an extreme heat warning at the exact same time it sat under a tropical storm warning, something that hadn't happened there in over 2 decades. That single number tells only part of the story, though. In that very same stretch of summer, hundreds of miles away in the American Midwest and Northeast, temperatures were doing something almost nobody expected in the middle of July, plunging low enough to break daily cold records that, in some cases, had stood for generations. Today, we're going to break down both sides of this extraordinary summer, the blistering heat that's already been tied to dozens of deaths across the country, the sudden and genuinely unusual cold snap that interrupted it in places you wouldn't expect, and why scientists say seeing both extremes collide in the same season is exactly the kind of pattern worth paying close attention to. Let's start with the heat, because it's been the defining story of the American summer of 2026, almost from the moment it began. Starting in late June, a severe and remarkably persistent heat wave settled over North America, and it hasn't really let go since. Between June 30th and July 5th alone, at least 148 daily high temperature records fell across the eastern United States. Washington, D.C. recorded its warmest 4th of July on record at 103 degrees. Philadelphia logged 3 consecutive days above 101 degrees for the first time in its entire recorded history. Atlantic City, New Jersey, tied its all-time hottest temperature ever measured at 106 degrees. Health officials across the country have already attributed roughly 70 deaths to this heat wave as of the first week of August, a grim reminder that extreme heat remains the deadliest form of weather in the United States, killing more Americans in an average year than tornadoes, hurricanes, and lightning strikes combined. Here's where that 121-degree figure actually comes from, and why. It's worth understanding the mechanism behind it, rather than just the shock value of the number itself. During Tropical Storm Bertha Lake Charles, Louisiana recorded a heat index, the measurement meteorologists use to describe what the temperature actually feels like to the human body once humidity is factored in, of 121 degrees Fahrenheit. That combination, tropical humidity colliding with extreme surface heat, is precisely why southern Louisiana found itself under both a tropical storm warning and an extreme heat warning simultaneously, the first time that specific overlap had occurred there since 2005. Heat index readings that extreme pushed the human body's cooling system to its absolute limit, since sweat can barely evaporate in air, already saturated with moisture, which is exactly why heat index warnings, not just raw, air temperature, are what actually drive hospital visits and heat-related deaths during events like this one. That same wave of tropical moisture didn't stop at Louisiana's border either. As it spread northeast in early August, New York City's dew point, a separate measure of how much moisture is actually in the air, climbed to 79 degrees on August 7th, just 1 degree, short of the city's all-time record, turning even a relatively ordinary afternoon temperature into something that felt genuinely oppressive on the street. If you're finding this breakdown useful, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this kind of weather coverage reach more people who want to understand what's actually happening, rather than just see another scary headline. The heat wasn't confined to the humid southeast either. As July wore on, a separate and equally punishing heat dome settled over the western and central United States. Phoenix reached 113 degrees across multiple consecutive days in early July, and Salt Lake City set a brand new all-time high of 109 degrees on July 12th. That same weekend, NASA's satellite temperature modeling showed numerous weather stations across Montana, Utah, and Wyoming recording their highest temperatures since record-keeping began in those areas, driven by a strong ridge of high pressure that parked itself over the northern Rockies and simply refused to move. In Maricopa County, home to Phoenix, health officials had already confirmed 40 heat-related deaths by the end of July, with months of summer heat still ahead at the same time. By the last week of July, Phoenix, Tucson, and Las Vegas were all pushing well. Past 110 degrees yet again, part of what forecasters described as a genuinely record-challenging heat dome, one of several to grip the country in rapid succession this summer. Overnight temperatures proved just as relentless as daytime highs through the middle of July, with the National Weather Service warning that more than 90 separate temperature records would be tied or broken across the country in a single week, the majority of them overnight heat records rather than daytime highs. Health experts consider that distinction genuinely important, since nights that never cool down deny the human body any real recovery window from daytime heat stress, making prolonged overnight warmth arguably more dangerous over time than any single scorching afternoon. Now, here's the twist to this story that most coverage of America's brutal summer completely misses. In the exact same stretch of days that Florida was baking under fresh record highs, with Orlando and Winter Haven both hitting 99 degrees on July 25th, a completely different air mass was doing the opposite thing just a few hundred miles north. A surge of unusually cool air pushed into the Midwest and Northeast in the days just before that, and it brought genuinely rare midsummer cold with it. On July 23rd, Youngstown, Ohio, recorded a daily low of just 47 degrees, cold enough to set a new record for that date in the official archive. Across the same stretch of days, multiple other Midwestern and Northeastern communities matched or broke their own daily cold records, an almost surreal contrast to the triple-digit heat. Dominating headlines out west and in the southeast at that exact same moment. That same cool intrusion arrived with its own share of extreme rainfall too, part of the same disturbed weather pattern. Zanesville, Ohio, logged a record 2.24 inches of rain on July 21st, while multiple West Virginia communities, including Elkins and Parkersburg, collected their own daily record. Rainfall totals within that same 48-hour window, with flooding striking several communities as the cooler air mass shouldered its way into the region. Think about what it actually takes to produce that kind of split-screen weather across a single country in the middle of summer. Both extremes ultimately trace back to the same underlying feature, an unusually wavy, contorted jet stream, the fast-moving river of air high in the atmosphere that normally keeps hot and cold air masses from mixing too dramatically. When that jet stream buckles into a sharp northward bulge in one region, it drags warm subtropical air far poleward beneath it, building the kind of heat dome that baked the Southwest and pushed Louisiana's heat index past 120 degrees. When the same jet stream simultaneously buckles into a sharp southward dip somewhere else, it does the exact opposite, dragging genuinely cool air down from Canada into places like Ohio and Pennsylvania that had no business seeing 47-degree mornings in the third week of July. Meteorologists describe this pattern as amplified or blocked, and it's precisely the kind of atmospheric configuration that produces the sharpest, most headline-grabbing extremes on both ends of the thermometer within the same week, sometimes even the same day. If storm and weather extremes coverage like this is something you want more of, subscribing means you'll catch the next update the moment the pattern shifts again. There's a broader climate story sitting underneath both halves of this summer that's worth understanding before drawing any conclusions from either extreme in isolation. Back in June, the National Weather Service confirmed El Niño conditions had developed across the Pacific, with forecasters flagging the possibility of a so-called Super El Niño as the year progressed, an event that climate scientists say directly increases both the frequency and intensity of heat waves across North America. That same broader pattern helps explain why this summer has produced heat records at such a relentless pace, with more than 90 separate temperature records tied or broken across the country in a single week in mid-July alone, and why forecasters have openly asked whether 2026 could end up ranking among the hottest years ever recorded globally. It's worth being precise about what the cold snap does and doesn't tell us here, because a handful of record lows in the Midwest doesn't erase the broader warming trend defining this summer, and it would be a mistake to treat isolated cold records as evidence against it. Researchers analyzing decades of NOAA station data have found that the overall ratio of new record highs to new record lows across the United States has shifted dramatically over time, from roughly even odds back in the 1950s to something closer to 6 record highs for every single record low being set in recent years. Genuine cold snaps, like the one that hit Youngstown in July, still happen, driven by the same kind of jet stream. Contortions that have always produced occasional out-of-season cold air, but they're becoming statistically rarer and more isolated, even as the total number of heat records set nationwide keeps climbing year after year. A single 47-degree morning in Ohio is real, notable, and worth reporting honestly, but it sits as an exception inside a summer where the dominant, overwhelming signal has been heat, not cold. Put another way, if you compared every daily weather station report across the entire country this July, the number of places setting new heat records would vastly outnumber the handful, like Youngstown that briefly went the other direction, even though both kinds of headlines circulated with roughly equal intensity on social media the same week. Bringing this all together, the summer of 2026 has genuinely delivered both ends of the thermometer in dramatic fashion. A heat index of 121 degrees in storm, battered Louisiana, triple-digit heat domes baking the Southwest and Rockies for weeks on end, and tucked into the middle of all that, a handful of genuinely rare summer cold records breaking in places that almost never see anything like it in July. That combination isn't a contradiction. It's a snapshot of exactly how an increasingly energetic atmosphere behaves, swinging harder and more suddenly between extremes, even as the overall balance keeps tilting unmistakably toward more heat, more often, in more places than at any point in the modern weather record.